Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragonix, and this is a dev letter of Blacksea Odyssey. What is a dev letter, you may ask? Well, it's my first impressions of a game, but it's also mixed in with some advice for the developers. The game is in early access, and so giving feedback to them for what to improve is important. Blacksea Odyssey came out on the Steam store on March 1st and is $9.99, but before I begin this dev letter, I want to make sure you guys know that this key was obtained from the developer for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? Now, Blacksea Odyssey is a top-down shooter with roguelike elements, and it's got more of a nautical theme despite the fact that it's set in space. Those who are familiar with Moby Dick should feel at home with this game because it's sort of got that feel to it in terms of going after these huge monsters and this whole bounty system that they're going for. So the object of the game is simple. Basically, you're facing 3 other bounty hunters in a sort of competition. You want to bag the biggest and best monsters in order to earn the most points after 5 total rounds. Now, you get a choice from a couple of levels. For example, I can try to get the Mega Larch here, which is worth 6,000 or so, or Nom 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 worth 7,600. Each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, of course. Now, as I mentioned, this is a top-down shooter, although this is a little bit different than others out there. Your main attack is the spear for the initial unlock character, which you can throw at enemies to do some reasonable damage. You fly around attempting to avoid that damage against the hundreds of enemies in the stage while looking for loot and the big baddie of the area. The level ends when you die or you've sent the boss to Davy Jones' locker. Control-wise, you can use a controller here, but I found that the mouse and keyboard works a lot better, in particular with the cursor on the screen. The time it can take for your projectiles to travel across the screen and hit your enemy can be significant, and you will need to lead your shots in order to be truly effective and have the precision that you want. To that extent, the controls can feel a little loose at first. You'll be struggling to get a rhythm to hit your enemies, but that actually works in this game. I mentioned that the game has a nautical theme to it, and it almost feels like you're fighting the tides of the game when trying to hit the enemy. This focus on leading enemies and hitting them in certain spots really works because the attacks have a speed on them, and you'll have to adjust accordingly depending on the items that you have. Your ship and your spear have 4 slots to put enhancers in, which can range from faster attacks to even exploding tipped spears, and you can swap them out to suit your playstyle. The ones I came across did reasonably change up the game, and I do think it'll help the roguelike nature of the game in terms of a long haul. But there's one other thing to note about your character. He has a harpoon, and specifically there's one mechanic that the game focuses on, limbs, and in particular, the destruction of limbs. Enemies have many appendages on their body, and if you do enough damage to them, they'll start to flash. At that point, you can use the right click to throw a harpoon to dig into the enemy's limb, and you can tear it off, dealing massive damage. This focus on weak points changes things up a lot, especially in big boss fights, and you'll have to rely on it in order to really take them down easily. And it's probably the strongest element the game has going for it. What's done well here is the enemies and their movement patterns in combination with the limb placement. Enemies will move around strangely and will fight you in terms of positioning of where their weak points are. Not in terms of active AI or anything, but they will make you work to be able to grab that weak spot. This feels like the tale of Moby Dick, you chasing the creature and attempting to take your prize, and when you do, it gives that thrill of success. Certain enemies will have a lot of weak points centered around one place, so you may hit the wrong target accidentally, or protections of shells to help it. Overall, this feels a lot different than other games in the genre, and that's a very, very good thing. On another note, even if you can't rip off a limb at that point, there's a secondary purpose to the harpoon. You can slow down an enemy and stay connected to him. Now, this is a double-edged sword. Harpooning onto him may put you in harm's way as well, so you'll need to move carefully to take advantage of it. Now, this is really helpful at times due to certain enemies' speed, and being able to keep up with them will help move things along. However, I will note that there's a certain weirdness in the length of your harpoon's rope, as it doesn't seem to stay consistent and abide by the laws of physics that I would expect. One thing that the harpoon needs desperately, though, is sound design. This is the best part of the game with the limb removal mechanic, and it would have a greater impact if the ripping of a limb had the appropriate sounds to go with it. I actually would recommend to the developers that this be the first thing they focus on. See, while it may seem minor to them, the actual audio and visual impact it could have gives the game that selling point, that, oh hey, that was awesome kind of element to it. Now in the level, enemies will drop keys that can open chests that will get you ruins, the enhancers that were mentioned before, items, and gold. The items and ruins have levels to them in the typical colored loot divisions, common, uncommon, and rare, and you'll need to rearrange things reasonably to take full advantage of them. Now these items are useful, and there's a reasonable balance between the use of the one-time items and their benefits. Although again, more item variety here will do well in the long haul. Control-wise, one thing that was awkward was the item usage, as I really had no good way to use a specific item in battle. I wish there was a way to cycle the items that are in the slots below, without having to go into a menu. I think for the sake of gameplay, it would be great to implement this. It gives the user more control over the situation. Also devs, note that your controller setup doesn't allow for menu navigation, which is rather annoying if you're going to play with the controller. Now, I mentioned the boost mechanic earlier in the video, and you'll really need to use the second and third levels of the boost to bust through elements of the environment. The environment is destructible, and with some of the cramped spacing in the levels, it can be really annoying to try and find an opening, so it's encouraged to just bust through. Honestly though, the second and third levels were only used by me for this purpose, as several areas are very claustrophobic, and in terms of battle, they felt unnecessary. One thing to the developers here, your game's rules at times are very strange. Enemies can seemingly ignore the environment entirely at times, going through solid surfaces without any explanation whatsoever. This doesn't help the player at all, and it really does feel a bit cheap at times. In fact, a lot of the levels feel too packed in. I do believe that some more varied level design could help in the long haul. Now, I do believe that the levels are procedurally generated, but the seeds that you use to create them may need a bit more variety to them. Expanding on that consistency topic, one thing that needs to be watched for is separating you from the enemies in the game. What I mean by that is, it should always be clear what I'm doing and what the enemy is doing. For example, there's a rune that can allow me to put an ice trail behind me, similar to other enemies in the game. But when putting down the ice trail, it's made clear very quickly that it's hard to differentiate your ice trail from your enemy's ice trail, and that just causes overall confusion. Maybe make your trail a dark shade or something that makes it clear that yeah, this is mine and that one is that one. Boss-wise, a good amount of the bosses are just bigger enemies with more health, which I did find disappointing despite it still being a challenge. But some of them feel like fighting Moby Dick, as the fights in question can take 2, 3, 5 minutes at a time, and feel like an epic encounter like they should. These can feel great and were the most fun I had with the game with the limb removal mechanic. But there's one slight catch. Some of the monsters are massive, and the limited zoom functionality makes it a bit hard to really fight them at times. There's this Colossus type element that you don't know where he starts or ends in terms of the boss, but considering the speed you can move around with, that becomes a problem with some enemies and your focus on their weak points. I will say that I want to see more from the developers, despite there being a good amount of content here. In particular, I want to see some more characters developed here. A roguelike game like this will live and die on the variety of the characters' playstyles, and I'm interested to see how much you're going to change things in terms of a character's mechanics. More emphasis on the harpoon, for example. There could be a variety of things you could do here, and it's going to really determine if you get the roguelike crowd behind the game. Blacksea Odyssey definitely has a potential to it, and a unique factor with the limb removal. While the game is still in development, it's nice to see that the developers are interacting with the fans by showing the development process on their Twitch channel during the weekdays. While again, I rarely recommend a game in early access, I will say that Blacksea Odyssey is definitely one to watch, and I hope that the devs take my advice to heart on how to improve the game, because the game definitely has the potential to do some very good things in the genre. Thanks for watching. Like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe if you want more content like this. In the description below, you'll find the Steam review accompanying this vid, along with social media that you can follow me on, Twitter, Google+, and Facebook groups. And if you want to support the channel, click that Patreon on the left of the screen. And remember, keep on gaming.